So she is.
Well, how
She is
here?
Kira's only 400 something.
You went to church the other day. She got along pretty good.
So she left the house.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone.
Good morning.
Good to see everybody out on this rainy, dreary evening.
I'm not surprised.
But we need the dreary weather, wet weather. That's great. We'll start by singing number 13, Wonderful Words of Life, Sacred Selections.
What number did you say?
13.
13.
Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of life. Let me more of their beauty see, wonderful words of life. Words of life and beauty, teach me faith and duty. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Christ the Blessed One gives to all wonderful words of life. Sinner, list to the loving call, wonderful words of life. All so freely given, wooing us to heaven. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Sweetly echo the gospel call, wonderful words of life. Offer pardon and peace to all, wonderful words of life. Jesus, only Savior, sanctify forever. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Number 23, Sweet Hour Prayer. And Jeff, after this song, would you lead us a prayer, please? Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, that calls me from a world of care, and bids me at my Father's throne make all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul has often found relief, and oft escaped the tempter's snare by thy return. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, thy wings shall my petition bear. To him whose truth and faithfulness engage the waiting soul to bless. And since he bids me seek his face, believe his word and trust his grace, I'll cast on him my every care and wait for thee, sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer. May I thy consolation share, till from Mount Pisgah's lofty height I view my home and take my flight. This robe of flesh shall drop and rise to seize the everlasting prize, and shout while passing through the air, farewell, farewell, sweet hour of prayer. Might stand, Brother Jeff.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this night to gather together again as a church family and study your words and sing songs of praise to you. We ask that as we prepare to go into this exercise that you open our hearts and our minds to the message that we'll receive tonight, that we can better understand it and better use it to do your will and spread your word. We ask that you be with those who could not be with us tonight due to illness or travel. Keep them safe and heal them if it be your will. And watch out for those that are suffering or have had difficulty or tragedies in their lives. And keep them safe. Keep them close to you. We ask this all in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Brother Lee.
Well, good evening, everybody. Tonight we're going to be in Genesis 41, but as we usually do, we'll go back to our lesson from last week and just do a quick review where we started a study of the life of Joseph in our last session. And Joseph is, of course, the 11th son of Jacob. And we noticed in our lesson last week that this sin of favoritism continues into the next generation. Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah, and Jacob loved Joseph more than the rest of his brothers. So we see this sin of favoritism continuing in the family of Jacob. And to make matters more difficult for Joseph, not only does his father favor him more than his brothers, but Joseph also has this gift of dreams. He has a couple of dreams, and these dreams only increase his brother's hatred for him. Now, there were two dreams. One dream had to do with Joseph and the brothers. The other dream had to do with Jacob and Rachel and the brothers. And the brothers were very irritated with Joseph, shall we say. And this is what leads them to make the most of their opportunity. When Joseph comes to them by himself, they decide they're going to do away with him. Reuben talks them out of putting him to death. Judah convinces them to sell him into slavery. And they go back to Jacob and they convince Jacob that Joseph is dead. And, you know, it's interesting. Again, we've talked several times about how there's this rhyming happening in these stories. Jacob was an opportunist. Jacob took advantage of the opportunity to purchase the birthright from his brother Esau, and he also took the opportunity to deceive his father to give him the blessing. So Jacob wasn't afraid of making the most of his opportunities, and that's exactly what the brothers did with Joseph. When they had him by himself, far, far away from Dad, where no one would know what was done to Joseph except for those who were present, they made the most of the opportunity. So you just see some of these family traits being passed down. Joseph, of course, ends up in Egypt as the 37th chapter concludes, and ends up a slave in the household of Potiphar. And we talked at the end of last week about how his story foreshadows Jesus' betrayal. Jesus was hated by his brothers, by his countrymen. He was betrayed into the hands of Gentiles for, in Jesus' case, 30 pieces of silver. In Joseph's case, 20 pieces of silver. So there's all kinds of parallels that we can draw between the two stories. That's chapter 37. Our story tonight is in chapter 41, so I thought I'd take just a couple of minutes to go through 38 through 40. And again, we have a very sordid tale in chapter 38 about Judah and Tamar. Again, to kind of keep this a PG-rated class as much as possible, we're not going to go through that story, but it's just another difficult story to understand. It's a very different culture than what we live in. Joseph became the steward of Potiphar's household in chapter 39, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, but Joseph flees from her. This is in chapter 39. He flees from her. She frames him. She claims he was trying to force himself on her. This lands Joseph in trouble. He ends up in prison. And while he's in prison in chapter 40, he befriends a cupbearer and a baker who served Pharaoh. They both had ended up in prison. They both had dreams. Joseph rightly interpreted their dreams. The baker ends up being executed, and the cupbearer's life is spared, and he ends up back in Pharaoh's service. This was the two dreams that Joseph interpreted for these two men. So that's what happens in between chapter 37 and chapter 41. And again, it's just sort of more of the same. Any questions or comments before we get into the new section? Does that kind of sum everything up? We good to move on? Good. All right, let's get into chapter 41 then. So Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. After 2 whole years, and I think that means after 2 years of Joseph being in prison, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. All right, Pharaoh has 2 dreams, and they're 2 dreams that parallel one another. We're going to get to that just in a moment, because there is a definite reason why the dreams are repeated, and Joseph's going to tell Pharaoh why in about 20 verses. But Pharaoh is troubled by this dream. He goes to his wise men and his magicians to ask for an interpretation, but they were stumped. They had no idea what these dreams meant. Now, the reason why Pharaoh went to the wise men is because in Eastern cultures, dreams were very important, and they were especially important to the Egyptians. In fact, they compiled books of dreams, records of dreams that they had. So dreams were seen as one way that the gods communicated with mankind. So Pharaoh probably concluded that the gods were talking to him in some way through these dreams. He goes to his wise men and his magicians, who would have been, from his vantage point, more in tune with what the gods might have to say, but they are stumped by the whole thing. Now, this is very similar to something that happens with Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. If you're familiar with Daniel's story, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he's troubled by the dream. He calls in all the wise men of Babylon. He asks for an interpretation. They say, we have no idea what it means. Nebuchadnezzar gets angry, and he threatens them. If nobody can interpret this dream, I'm going to put you all to death. And that's when Daniel hears about this and says, hey, I can interpret dreams. And Daniel has an audience with Nebuchadnezzar. He tells Nebuchadnezzar the dream and then tells him the interpretation. So just like Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar's dream troubled him. The wise men could not interpret. Now let's go back and talk just a little bit about the dreams themselves. And there is an important little detail that is in the first dream. Did you notice how the cows came out of the Nile? They came out of the Nile River. And that, I think, is an important little detail that we'll circle back to here in a little bit when we talk about what these dreams mean, because these dreams are a prediction of a famine to come. And the Nile River played an outsized role in agricultural production in Egypt. We'll talk about some of that here in a little bit. Any questions or comments about the dreams? Anything confusing? Are we good to keep moving? Good to keep moving? All right, let's keep moving. Verses 8 through 14. So in the morning, his spirit, this is Pharaoh, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about, I was restored to my office in the dream, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. All right, so the cupbearer remembers. He remembers how he was spared and the baker was put to death. This was back in Genesis chapter 40. And all of this was alluded to in a dream that Joseph interpreted for both men. Now Joseph, before he is presented to Pharaoh, is cleaned up. The Egyptians were very particular about the appearance of people. They were very prejudiced against Asiatic people. That's not a perfect word. It can be used as almost sort of a mild slur, but I was having problems maybe saying Asians just in general might be the better way to put that. Anyways, they had a problem with people that lived to the east of them. We'll just put it that way. They were very prejudiced against those people because the Egyptians are like almost all cute cultures in human history. They were xenophobic. They hated foreigners. We live in a very different era. In Western civilization, we've gone to great lengths to try to meld a lot of different cultures together. That's especially true here in America. We've been somewhat successful at times, and we've been abject failures at others. But for the course of human history, most people are suspicious of foreigners, and the Egyptians are no different. So this is one reason why Joseph not only has to be dressed up to be presented before Pharaoh, but he also has to be shaved, because facial hair was very insulting to the Egyptians. They liked their men clean shaven, just like the Greeks later on. Although the Greeks, their reason for shaving facial hair had to do with, well, it was a military strategy, right? If you don't have a beard, you don't have something that can be grabbed in battle. That was kind of the whole thinking behind Alexander the Great, making sure all of his men were clean shaven, which was one of the he was the man who really pushed this in Greek culture. Anyways, the Egyptians were very offended by facial hair, and they valued cleanliness. They were a clean people, and they valued cleanliness. So these little details actually do matter. They are giving us little glimpses into Egyptian culture. So before Joseph could be taken before Pharaoh, all of this had to happen. Now, in the next few verses, Pharaoh goes on to describe the dreams to Joseph. I'm not going to go back through and read those. So we're just going to skip Pharaoh's description. But before we move on, any questions, comments? We good so far? Everybody tracking here? Yep. We good? All right, let's keep moving then. Verses 25 through 32. Boy, we're moving fast tonight. I may not have enough slides. Like the first Thursday night that's happened. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. All right. So you have 2 dreams because God is offering to Pharaoh 2 witnesses. Joseph had 2 dreams back in chapter 37. You've got, in the case of the cupbearer and the baker, when you put them together, you've got 2 dreams there. And then you've got Pharaoh having 2 dreams in chapter 41. And the reason for this is God is saying to Joseph and to Pharaoh, these things will come to pass. This was God's way of saying, I'm going to bring the thing that's going to happen in the future that is foretold by these dreams. I am going to bring it to pass. The 2 dreams are one. And as Joseph says later on in verse 32, the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God and God will shortly bring it about. I think last week when we were talking about chapter 37, I might have mentioned that principle from the old law, the book of Deuteronomy. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, we'll say every fact will be established. The idea was, if you have a person accused of a crime, 1 witness was not enough to convict. You needed 2 or 3 witnesses whose testimony agreed in order to convict someone of a crime. The same sort of principle is at work with God giving 2 dreams. 1 dream might just seem like a random occurrence. But 2 dreams centering around the same subject, maybe from 2 different angles, is God's way of eliminating randomness, so to speak. He's making this a deliberate way of communicating with both Joseph in chapter 37 and Pharaoh in chapter 41. Now, what I really like about Joseph is there's a humility in this man that I really admire a great deal. Joseph strikes me as a very capable person. But we've seen him, we didn't really study this story, but I mentioned it. He's a man of integrity. He would not take advantage of his master's wife when she made herself available to him. He ran away. And when he offers an interpretation to the cupbearer and to the baker, Joseph says to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. And it's a lot like what he says to Pharaoh in chapter 41, verse 16. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. For all his capabilities, and he seems to be a very talented man. Joseph is also a humble man. And he acknowledges that this gift of interpretation is a gift from God. So he does not take the credit for himself. I want to bring this up one more time because I mentioned this last week and I just want to circle back to reinforce it one more time. It's just imperative for us to remember that when God is communicating through dreams and visions, we need to be sure we use the Bible to unlock the meaning of those dreams and visions. It's one reason why, whenever I take a congregation through a study of the book of Revelation, I'll take the time to look at other passages in the Bible where the same symbolism is used and try from those passages to rightly interpret what the symbolism means in the book of Revelation. I think that that's the right way to approach interpreting symbols in the Bible, because God has a specific meaning in mind. So we should use the Bible to define the symbols the Bible employs. It might seem like circular reasoning, but I don't think it is. It seems to me like if God's communicating this, then we need to go back to the source in order to figure out what exactly he means. So, any questions or comments? We're doing good so far. I know I'm feeling sleepy, but It's kind of a dreary night, so, admittedly, I'm just really glad you all are here tonight. So you're keeping me inspired to stay awake. All right. We'll continue pushing through here. Chapter 41, verses 33 through 40. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. So Joseph has moved from interpreting the dreams to now making a policy recommendation to Pharaoh. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." All right, so Joseph decides to make a policy recommendation. He recommends that Pharaoh find a wise and discerning man. Someone needs to oversee the collection of grain during these good times. And Pharaoh just decides, well, who better than a man who's got the Spirit of God? This man obviously is in tune with the God who sent these 2 dreams to me. So who better to put in this position than the interpreter of the dreams? Now, what's interesting about this position that Joseph is elevated to is there is an actual position in Egyptian history that was held by others down through the years in the Middle Kingdom and later in the New Kingdom. It's the position of vizier. I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce it, but that's what I'm going to go with this evening. Does that sound right to you, vizier? That seems right to me. We're just going to go with that. It's basically like a prime minister. Now, some of you have your roots in merry old England. So in England right now, there's a king sitting on the throne of England. But England is actually governed by Parliament, right? And the way Parliament works, you've got 2 houses. You've got the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the way it works is whichever party comes to power in the House of Commons, either because they receive the most votes or because they cobble together several different parties to form a consortium of sorts, they then elect a prime minister. So the prime minister is either the head of that party or he is the acknowledged leader of several parties. The prime minister then goes to the king and he asks for permission to organize a government on the king's behalf. And the king, up to this point, and the queen that was before him, has given permission for the prime minister to govern England in his name. So this is essentially what a prime minister does. He's not the head, but he is a powerful person. And that's essentially the position of the Egyptian vizier. This, as I said a moment ago, was a position occupied by many others. It's very popular later on in the New Kingdom. So Egypt's history is divided up into Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, basically. Okay? You had a lot of viziers in the New Kingdom, and only a few stretching back into the Middle Kingdom, which is the era in which Joseph is in Egypt. But there are some cases of it, and it looks like to me that that's the position that Joseph was promoted to. The vizier was the chief record keeper of the government. He supervised construction work and industry in Egypt's state-run economy. He was in charge of agricultural production, and the vizier welcomed foreign embassies coming to Egypt. And when you look at the jobs that Joseph was doing in Pharaoh's name, those jobs all fall under the job description of the Egyptian vizier. And this is confirmed a little bit later in chapter 45, verse number 8. And this isn't quite as clear as I would like for it to be, but there's some smoke here, so there's probably a little bit of fire as well. In chapter 45, verse number 8, Joseph says that God had made him a father to Pharaoh. And that literally means a father of the God. Now, that might seem like maybe Joseph has gotten a little too big for his britches. Maybe he's being lifted up with pride. But actually, that was a title that was given to officials who served the crown well. So if a pharaoh had an official who had done a great job for the kingdom, he would give him this title, Father of the Pharaoh, or Father of the God. And this seems to speak to this position of vizier that Joseph was raised to. He also says in that verse that Pharaoh had made him lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. All this just seems to point in this particular direction. So one of the really cool little details that we learn in this story about Joseph can be confirmed through Egyptian history. This was something that actually took place in Egypt quite often, especially later on in the New Kingdom. Now, I'm not an expert in Egyptian history, so I don't know that we need, don't ask me a whole lot of questions about it, but I'm not nearly as well read in that as I am in like Greek and Roman history. So I can maybe go a little bit deeper on this, but I don't know how much further I can really go. So if you have any questions, bear that in mind. I might not be able to answer them. So, yes, Chad.
More of a comment than a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Throughout the interactions with Pharaoh, if my understanding is correct with Egyptian stuff, Pharaoh was a earthly incantation of the sun god Ra.
Correct.
So that was they were considered a demigod, a divine ruler, and again they were part of that. And throughout the different interactions here and with Moses dealing with Pharaoh, the Pharaohs acknowledged the God of Abraham.
Yes, they did.
I just have always found that interesting that they themselves are considered by their culture to be a god, and yet they are still acknowledging the God of Abraham.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you run into that in other instances in the Old Testament. It's not that other nations denied the existence of Jehovah. It's more that they saw him as one among many. He's just the God of Israel, but he's not the one true and living God. So that's a good point to bring up. Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting how Moses begins that negotiation with Pharaoh. He basically begins, let us go out into the wilderness for 3 days so that we can worship our God, right? So that's how that negotiation begins, sort of on those same lines. Tammy, is that a hand?
No.
Oh, I was so hopeful.
Sorry.
Man, oh, that's okay. One of these days, it's going to be real.
I'll do it.
All right. I'm looking forward to it. All right. Anything else?
The thing,
Yeah, Darrell.
I'm kind of intrigued by Joseph's journey, and we can say he comes across as arrogant or thinks he's special, or I may be too strong there, but he did receive the dreams about his mom and dad and his brothers, and he told them, and that led to more jealousy.
Yeah.
He did tell the Pharaoh the dreams. He did tell his brothers when they finally come down, that last verses you was reading there, that, but every time he gives credit to God.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about that. And it had to be providence, right? This whole thing was God's will. I mean, maybe not every detail, because we talked about that with Sodom and Gomorrah. There are things God could not have been pleased, but the outcomes, I guess, is what I'm thinking about. Yeah,
that's a really, really good point. And we're not going to study this, but if we go over to Genesis chapter 50, after Jacob dies, the brothers are a little worried about what's going to happen to them.
Yeah.
And we find the verse here. Yeah, down around verse 15 is where it starts. Verse 19. Joseph says to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. You know, we'll talk about this next week when we get into Joseph's interaction with his brothers, because you can read that and think, well, Joseph's just being a arrogant jerk. But actually, I think what's going on is his trust of his brothers was broken. I mean, look at what they did to him, right? And I do think there may have been some pride there, but I think there was also, I mean, the word I kept coming back to last week was naivete. You know, he just was a little naive about how much they hated him. And maybe he was just being a typical guy and trying to get a one-up over his brothers. Maybe there was some of that, but I don't think he appreciated just how much they hated him. And when they come back asking for grain, he's not the naive young man anymore. And he's not just going to trust them just because they've showed up on his doorstep. They have to earn his trust. And, you know, that's a good example for the rest of us as well, in my estimation. When you have a person who has broken trust with you so deeply, I don't think we're called to automatically just waltz right in and, you know, and turn the keys over to them, so to speak, right? I think that trust has to be re-earned. And, you know, I think we need to be willing to work toward that with someone who wants to rebuild that relationship. We need to be open to that, but I think trust in some cases has to be earned. And that, I think, is what happens with his brothers. And I'm kind of giving a little bit of a preview for our story next week. But that's one of the important lessons that I take away from his interaction with his brothers.
I don't think it was any accident that he was the youngest.
Yeah.
Because I don't, you know, if he was the oldest, I don't think he would have had this play out quite like it did.
Yeah.
So he was younger and he was trying to probably impress his older siblings, make a name for himself, or get them to acknowledge him, just even pay attention to
Exactly
him.
right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
He was kind of almost like the forgotten stepchild, so to speak. And what a family dynamic. I mean, most of the brothers come from the mother who is unloved by her husband. And, you know, we would call it, I think in our day and age, probably an abusive relationship. That's probably the word we would choose for it. You know, and here's Joseph, you know, the mother that was loved, and Joseph, he's given the tunic of many colors. It is one of those things where, like, a lot of different factors all begin to kind of play in together. And one of the beautiful things, and I really appreciate both Beth and Darl's comment, because what this is pointing us toward is how God can use all kinds of different circumstances in our life, both good and bad, to accomplish his purpose, to bring about good in our life. And, you know, we talk about Romans 8, I think it's 8:28, that God works all things together for good, for those who are the called of God, for those who are called according to his purpose. Sorry, I'm butchering that a bit. But it's good for us to remember, the promise is not that things will always be good. The promise is God will work all things together for good. And I think the story of Joseph is a case in point where we see some good and some bad being mixed together and used by God in order to save an entire family from famine. And again, keeping that family intact is imperative because who's going to come from that family down the road? The Savior of the world. So the story of Joseph, I think, just is really beautiful on a lot of different levels and very relatable to us.
This is probably I should know the answer to this, but I'd just like to hear you just talk about it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph was not, we wouldn't call him a prophet, correct?
I would call him a prophet.
Okay.
Yeah, I would.
But
Mm-hmm.
that's because the outcome is similar to being a prophet. So because you can interpret dreams, Joseph doesn't make very many mistakes.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying?
I do.
And I really like your comment that God, all things put together for good, because there was some things he did that caused some of his problems.
Yeah.
But he saw the end, and I mean, he accomplished what he was here to accomplish. Is what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
So he either was he was inspired through the interpreting dreams, and he pretty well knew, not that he could foresee the future without the dreams, but he sure seems to have been aligned with God and what God's will was.
Yeah, and we could put it this way. Sometimes things happen in life, and we're not entirely sure where they're leading, but then once they've happened, it's like, it kind of seems like maybe there was a purpose for that. And I kind of wonder if that might be a little bit of what goes on with Joseph. It's like when his brothers first come to him and they need food for the famine, does he know at that point why God has put him in Egypt to do? Maybe not at that point, but as everything unfolds and as he looks back, he can see that there was a purpose and a path. It's a very, very comforting story for a lot of reasons. All right, let's keep moving here. I think I'm going to make it all the way to the end. How about that? Great comments. Great comments. Yeah. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, this is 41 through 46, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, went through all the land of Egypt. All right, so Joseph is given three symbols of power. He's given a signet ring, he's given garments of fine linen, and a gold chain is placed around his neck. Now, in Egyptian pictures and hieroglyphics and other pictures, we see many reward scenes in Egyptian art. And almost all of those reward scenes involve a gold chain. So this is perfectly in keeping with Egyptian history. What happens to Joseph is consistently depicted throughout Egyptian artwork. And he's also placed in the second chariot, which of course is a position of honor as well. And he is given a very advantageous marriage. Joseph is given the daughter of Potipherah, the priest of On. Now, On is actually a city in Egypt. It was the city the Greeks later called Heliopolis. The Nile runs south to north. We'll talk a little bit about that maybe here in a few minutes. We'll see how fast this goes. It runs from south to north, and when it gets up to the north of Egypt, as it's emptying out into the Mediterranean, it forms a delta, right? Just like the Mississippi River, as it's flowing down into the Gulf of Mexico, it forms that delta. Well, if you look at a map of the Nile, it does the same thing, and On is sitting up at one of those branches off of the Nile going up into the Mediterranean Sea. So the city of On at this time in history was the center of solar worship, and Chad's already mentioned Re or Ra, who was the supreme deity of the Middle Kingdom. So what seems to be happening here is Joseph is given the daughter of the high priest of Ra. What's his name? Potiphar Ra. Just like a lot of names in Hebrew end with an I-M. I'm trying to think of a good example here. My name just went blank. Like Elijah, for example. Elijah, that J-A-H at the end has to do with the name of God. Yeah.
Along those lines, Heliopolis is Greek for city of the sun.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very good. Very good. Yep. Okay, so we have a black and white map here today. I made my errors last week. Sorry for a confusing map. Hopefully this is a little bit clearer than what was happening last week. So here you got the Nile River, right, running from south to north. Okay, Heliopolis or On is, whoop, I kind of missed that. Let me try that one more time. There we go, is right there. Just incidentally, Cairo wasn't founded until like 900 AD, so this map is not like historically accurate back to the time of Joseph, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of where Heliopolis was. So this map showed it very clearly. That's where On is located. Okay? And here we have an artist's conception of the temple of Re or Ra at On, known to the Greeks as Heliopolis. And you might notice what's the name of these guys right here? That's the Washington Monument. It's an
Obelisk.
Obelisk, thank you. I almost said ellipsis, but that's not right. An obelisk, right? That's where we got the idea for the Washington Monument. All right. That just gives you a little bit of an idea. Joseph married up in the world. This is a very advantageous marriage for Joseph. And, you know, you may be thinking to yourself, well, how could he fall in love with the daughter of the high priest of a pagan god? Well, this is one of those marriages that you don't refuse. When Pharaoh gives you a wife, you don't say no to Pharaoh. So, you know, this is something that you accept graciously. I don't see this as any indication that Joseph is compromising his morals in any way. He's just been placed in this position and he's given this wife, and he, I think, just makes the best of the situation. All right. Continuing on, verses 47 through 52. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of those 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Notice that I am on the end of Ephraim's name. That's part of the name of God there at the end. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. All right. 2 sons. So the name Manasseh literally means making forgetful. Couple of things about Manasseh. Not one of the more important tribes, but does play a role in Israel history that's worth taking some note. This was the tribe of Gideon. Gideon, who was one of the judges. He's got a big story in the book of Judges. He was from the tribe of Manasseh. And Manasseh is also a name that's a bit infamous because one of the worst kings of Judah happened to share that name, the name Manasseh. Ephraim is a little bit more noteworthy. Ephraim means fruitfulness. Joshua, the helper of Moses, who later became the leader of the children of Israel, came from the tribe of Ephraim. And Ephraim was also the first royal house of Israel. So remember, the nation split into two, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Ephraim was the first ruling house in Israel. Jeroboam was from the tribe of Ephraim. So Ephraim was a more important tribe than Manasseh. And once again, notice how the second son manages to supersede the first son, at least as far as Israelite history goes. All right, so two more children. Got just a few more slides, and I want to be sure I get to the rest of this here. Yeah, we'll go ahead and read this. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. Now, way back, I don't know how many slides ago, but quite a few slides ago, I made note that the cows came out of the Nile. Okay? Here is another map of Egypt. And I chose this map for a very specific reason. You can follow the course of the Nile here by just following this green area right here. Now, why is this area around the Nile in green, while everything to the east and the west and the south is brown? Anybody know? Yeah, because the only reason why they could grow crops in Egypt was because of the Nile. The Nile flooded every year. Rains down here from the south, and I'm not exactly sure. This is around the area of Sudan, and you get down into here, and this is Ethiopia, where the Nile begins, although it begins a little further south than that. Anyways, they had a monsoon season in Ethiopia, and the river runs from south to north. And that monsoon season in Ethiopia would flood the Nile River. Now, flooding was a good thing, because flooding would leave behind fertile soil. Unless you had too much rain, in which case you'd have too much flooding and you wouldn't be able to plant. So you'd have a year where there wouldn't be much of a crop. Or you had too little rain and the river didn't flood, in which case you wouldn't have enough fertile land to produce a crop. I think the reason why the cows came out of the Nile is because the famine in Egypt had something to do with the Nile flooding. I'm going to skip this next slide because we're almost out of time. But anyways, so there's a couple of different possibilities as to what caused this famine. Maybe it was drought. It could have been that there was no rain in the area south of Egypt. And that kind of makes sense because you have a famine that's widespread, right? It's affecting not just Egypt, but it's affecting up into the land of Canaan as well. Drought conditions in the land of Canaan, maybe if you think back to those dreams, maybe that's why the stalks were blighted by the east wind. So you've got a drought in the south down in Ethiopia, not enough rain, not producing the floods up north in Egypt, not able to grow any food. You've got the wind coming from the east, drying things out, so to speak. Perhaps it's a drought. But it's worth bearing in mind that this famine in Egypt could also be caused by too much water. Maybe it was dry up in Canaan, but maybe it was too much water in Ethiopia, which means that the Nile would be flooding. So you've got flooding in Ethiopia, flooding up in Egypt, while you've got drought conditions elsewhere. So what I think we can conclude with a great deal of certainty is something happened with the Nile. Things were good for 7 straight years, bumper crops. And then for 7 years, things weren't quite right, and there was a drought. We can't be entirely sure as to the cause. I'm not sure that we have any records that stretch back that far in Egyptian history. So we don't know if it was too little or too much water, but both of those are possibilities. So just throw that out there for consideration. Jordan, also named after a river. I'm sorry to throw you off there. Go ahead.
My name is biblical.
Yes, it is.
So is this too.
Yes, it is.
Yep. The last verse of that chapter, the New American Standard says all the earth had the whole earth, and then it said the whole earth would come to Egypt to get grain.
Yes.
So I wonder, does that mean the whole earth, literally?
Yeah, I don't think so. Probably just this region. Every nation came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for this famine was severe in every land. That's the way that Holman Christian Standard Bible translates it. Let's see what the ESV does with it. All the earth is what the ESV puts, the way it puts it. I think probably this is just all the earth as in all that region, every nation, so to speak, that was in that region. I don't know that that means that people from China were coming all the way over. If we had that big of a famine stretched across that broad of a part of the world, over the whole world, so to speak, I think we'd have some sort of record of that elsewhere. So I've always just interpreted this as sort of a regional thing, like the nations in this region. And by region, I mean a pretty wide geographical area. I mean, you think about it here. We could have a drought all across the Midwest that would affect a geographical region of roughly the same size. You know, it would not be unheard of. So that's the way I've always taken it. You got any other insights there, Jordan? Yeah.
Nope, I was just wondering.
Yeah,
I just wonder if it doesn't mean what the known world is to them.
Yeah, that's the way I would think of it, yeah.
Because they tend to be self-centered. They're the center of the world
Right.
to begin with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's the way I tend to think of it. Yeah. Like when you get over into Revelation, like the earth, it can mean a lot of different things depending on, you know, how you interpret that. So, yeah. Good comment. All right. Go ahead,
The
Darrell.
green along the river is, I mean, just where we live, I mean, that was a topographical map and showed the highlands and the desert there to the west. And the fertile is the Nile River.
Yeah.
That's the most fertile, and it says that.
Mm-hmm.
The most fertile around here is the Sheridan River, Blackbird. I've got clay on the hill, and down the bottom I've got nice black dirt.
Yeah.
And that'd be the way to be there also.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
of erosion, the soil coming down to the valley.
Yeah, exactly right. And flooding's a good thing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
people who've got farmland down along the Missouri River, when it floods, I mean, you might get wiped out for that year, but boy, that's good for crops in future years. Go ahead.
Grew up farming the Sheridan River bottom, and Dad was happy if we would get one crop every 3 years,
Yeah.
because you would lose, but that's just pretty common to be flooded out 2 years, but you get one good crop.
That's probably a really good crop, I would guess.
Yeah, it was great, yeah,
Yeah.
that 1 year.
High
That's-
yield.
That's just what you depended on if you could get one out of 3.
Yeah.
So it wasn't 7 years, but it was.
Yeah, I remember talking with a farmer who farms along the Missouri River, and he said, you know, he told me one time they had like 3 or 4 really good years in a row, and then they had a bunch of flooding. He's like, hey, we had 3 or 4 really good years, so you just don't complain about that 1 or 2 bad years that you have. Very good. Anything else? Yeah, Priscilla. Sorry, Chad.
Ephraim,
Mm-hmm.
isn't it kind of like, in the prophets, they use Ephraim as like a phrase for the whole nation of Israel?
Yes.
So why is that?
I think that's because the first ruling house came from Ephraim. Jeroboam was of the tribe of Ephraim, and then those who came after him, although that was eventually taken away from the house of Ephraim. But I think that's the reason why, because it started as the leading tribe in the north. Yeah. I think it's in Hosea, isn't it, that it refers to Ephraim quite a lot? Yeah. That's been my conclusion. I can't really think of another explanation. Chad, did you have something?
Just a minor comment. What you said about the Nile and rivers in general being the life of an area is absolutely true. But even on top of that, that's also historically, especially the way that all the food was also transported.
Oh yeah, good point.
So it actually double served as the lifeline for these areas.
Yeah. There's a guy out there. He's written a couple of books, The Next Decade and The Next 100 Years. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He's a geostrategist, I think is what he calls himself. And anyways, he really comes back to the fact that America has the Missouri and the Mississippi and the Ohio. We got these huge rivers, and that really lends itself to long-term stability because agriculture really is a basis for a stable economy. And the fact that we have navigable waterways with lots of tillable land, I mean, that just puts America in a very advantageous position. So
I point out to my students in class that with some rare exceptions globally, where are all your major cities at?
Yeah.
And they're either on major rivers or they're in protected bays.
Absolutely.
And there is a reason for that. And that actually is the transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's pretty rare. You think of like a Denver, for example.
Yeah. There are exceptions.
Yeah, there's exceptions.
And most of
Phoenix. but you're exactly right.
For the most part, because we now have modes of transportation other than water.
Exactly right.
Are all on water.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and if times were to change and things were to get more difficult, what you're going to see people is gravitating toward those sorts of areas, right? Because that's going to be more stable. Go ahead.
There's we just on that topic, a crazy statistic, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but 92% of all statistics are made up on the spot anyway. So
survey says
something like 5% of the continental United States is within 100 miles of the coast, and something like 40% of the population lives within that 100 miles.
Yeah,
it's a crazy statistic.
It is crazy.
I'm going to make up a statistic.
Okay, go for it.
Well, in 1900, 95% of the population did not live in the big cities.
Yeah.
In the rural, agrarian area. And if certain things happen, and some of the modern things that make those cities livable are taken away, they'll be back out here.
Yeah, sure they will be.
New York doesn't produce any food.
Exactly right.
Just look at what happened with the COVID.
So I mean that's then transportation was the reason, as Chad said, that is what formed that. Look at our state lines. State lines were major cities. Memphis is on. That was the way state lines were made until you got out to the four corners of the Southwest, and they just arbitrarily said this is where your state is. Yeah. But rivers define a lot of states.
Yeah, they sure do.
And that's the compromises they made is doing it. So.
Yeah, I think it's one reason why it's important for us to keep churches in rural areas strong, because we may see a reversal of this trend. We may see people coming back out to the country, especially with the connectivity we have available to us. If you've got a good internet connection, the way people can remote into jobs, it can be very attractive to live in a rural area. So we need to keep the churches in these areas strong, because we might have brethren who need a place to worship moving to us. So I might get in trouble with some of the locals by suggesting that, but it could happen. Things could change, and we may see a reversal. I mean,
it might explode and grow.
Hey, the guy who's behind the pulpit right now is one example. Howie and Peggy moved here from Wisconsin, right? Yeah. There's a lot of value in a rural community that I think people, if they knew about it, they would covet it, and they'd want it for themselves
People
and their
moved here from
families.
Florida.
Oh yeah, pardon me, Priscilla. Yep, exactly right. Jordan doesn't count. Yeah. You don't count technicality.
East Peoria, right?
Yeah, East Peoria. Yeah. Of course, you got nights stretching back to the Civil War around here. So yeah. Yeah.
One
Go
of the
ahead,
things
Jeff.
I noticed, Wade, I've been reading the Bible again this year chronologically.
Good.
And I just went through this not only with you, but through how I was reading it. And one of the things that jumped out at me, and one of the things I've seen in some of the commentaries about it, are the parallels between Joseph and Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How many of them there are? I mean, there's half a page of them listed here.
Yeah.
And it's just unreal how, like you said, it rhymes.
It rhymes. Yeah. There's a lot of foreshadowing in the Bible, and that's one of the real values of going through the Old Testament stories. Is it adds a richness to the New Testament. Not that you need the Old Testament to understand the New Testament, but it adds a richness to our understanding of the New Testament that I find it very affirming personally. And you also just get to know human nature a whole lot better in the Old Testament.
It also gives you some reinforcement of what you've read and understand from the New Testament, because some of the stuff in the Old Testament, a lot of the stuff is now being proved historically and archaeologically.
Sure, yeah.
So.
Yeah. And who knows, we might just continue to see that trend happening more and more. Well, we're like 6 minutes over time. Great discussion. Oh, Jordan's going to be that guy that holds us just a little longer. Go ahead, Jordan.
Speaking of chronologically,
Yeah.
that word priest that you mentioned,
Yes.
Joseph married.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, that's the second time the word priest is mentioned in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The first is Melchizedek.
Yes.
So it's interesting that a priest is mentioned of foreign religion, if you want to use that word, before the priest, the Levitical priesthood.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's just a point.
It is. Yep. Good point. Very good. Well, I'm going to call the little boys in here, so really appreciate the discussion. Great comments, great questions. You all made the class even better. Well, I don't know. That seems like sort of a self-serving comment, doesn't it? You made the class great. How about that? There we go. That's a little bit better. I need to take some humility lessons from Joseph, apparently. Oh, mercy.
It took him a while too.
I feel like I'm operating on one brain cell this evening, and it feels like it's about half gone. So,
Hey, I can vouch you've been on the run. So.
oh, Beth saw me at Home Depot at about 4:00, and I was, I needed to go to Menards next. I told the guy in Home Depot, I was like, "You're gonna send me to your green neighbors, aren't you?" They didn't have what I needed. So yeah, I was a bit harried. Yeah. Good to see Johnsy and Boone tonight. Yeah. Well, we'll take a moment to extend the gospel invitation. If we can help anybody obey the gospel, or if anybody needs help coming back to the Lord, we invite you to take advantage of this opportunity as we stand and sing the number that Darrell has selected.
571. I know we're running a little late, but this song, Bringing in the Sheaves, is an old song. We've talked about that a little bit before. And it's from Psalms 126:6. And the old songs, one of the things that is recognizable by a lot of the old songs is they're based on Scripture. And this is one. And I thought it was good, and I was thinking about our lesson tonight, but in verse 5 of that 126th Psalm, those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. He who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. So I get from that there's going to be sorrow out there sowing seeds. And evangelists, any of us that does that work, there's going to be sorrow, but the thing that we're accomplishing is the goal is to bring in sheaves, the harvest that we're doing. So I thought of that with the drought and the and the growth. So anyway, so let's sing this. Sowing in the morning, sowing seeds of kindness, sowing in the noontide and the dewy eve, waiting for the harvest and the time for reaping. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. Sowing in the sunshine, sowing in the shadows, fearing neither clouds nor winter's chilly breeze. By and by the harvest and the labor ended, we shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. Going forth with weeping, sowing for the Master, though the loss sustained our spirit often grieves. When our weeping's over, He will bid us welcome. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. Any announcements?